The Brooklyn Nets lose a nail-biter north of the border against the Toronto Raptors. We're going to break down how close they came to stealing a key win here as they wait for the Stars to return, why the role players continue to give us a great sample size, and yet come up just short right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you'll find the sultry sounds of Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, DraftKings, FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, covering the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, the game that could have been 109-108. The Brooklyn Nets fall to Toronto on the home and home. Looked like they had it almost in their grasp, and yet they come up just short. And this is yours truly getting lost in all those old school Nets fandom vibes of a plucky upstart looking to steal one on the road.
Yeah, this one hurt. This one hurt because this was basically in the end a 50-50 game, and there was a couple things that did not go their way, a couple like curious decisions by Jacque Vaughn that we'll talk about at the end. I don't want to put the loss firmly at his feet here. I thought this was just one of those games. It's one of those coin flip ones. Like the Raptors were undermanned to the point where, I mean, they weren't dissimilar to the game before, but they were undermanned. It's the same way pretty much the Nets were undermanned. I would still say they probably have more aggregate talent than Brooklyn, but Brooklyn played really, really hard. They had a few key things go their way, especially in the third quarter. But when it came to actual crunch time and needing a couple buckets to be able to get over the hump, or to not make some key mistakes, or to maybe make some rotation stuff, this all stuff we'll get into, they just weren't able to get it done. And on the macro level, did you mention this again like already, but we're the playing thing? Like on the macro level, this game hurts pretty bad. Like this actually, I hate to like overweight one loss, but this would have been a really nice one to get when it comes to playing stuff also. And so, yeah, this one hurts. I was on the proverbial edge of my seat here in a way that I'm sometimes in, I'm sometimes not, but for sure with this one.
Yeah, and we'll go into the specifics of this game, some of the late game sequences. You mentioned Jacque Vaughn as well, filling in for now his second game as the head coach with Nash out in the COVID protocols. But the high level, we talk about the positioning in the standings. We know when you play head-to-head, a win gets you a full game back, a loss takes you down a whole game. And because we were sitting here talking about it being the conclusion of the season series with the Raptors, if the Nets had won this game, they would have taken the series 3-1 on the season, and that would have put them in the position to pull neck and neck maybe at some point here down the stretch and have that tiebreaker against the Raptors. Instead, the season series now stands at 2 games apiece, and that just means even in a virtual tie, you're going to go to some other variables around this thing, not to mention the fact you keep yourself another game back behind the Raptors, knowing some guys are going to return here. But it would have been nice to, off the heels of that last night, the night before, where it looked like wheels could have fallen off, depending on your opinion or perspective. But I did think from the high level, you mentioned this, if Toronto doesn't shoot 60% from beyond the arc in the first half of the game, which they didn't, and if the Brooklyn Nets don't have some all-time clunkiness around turnovers and just bad luck rebounding, this is the kind of game we thought they could have had the night before too. I think this was more indicative of what these games should have looked like in both instances. And then maybe the Nets are able to get one of them and walk away from this thing on even ground.
For sure. Like from an overall effort standpoint, I would say it's an A+. Like I think you can't give it anything short of that from an effort standpoint. Yep. Like, you know, where we criticized the team in the home game on Monday night, where it looked like no one was trying. And it was a combination of the effort was terrible plus the execution was terrible, like F's on both. This one, the execution was much better. The effort level was much better. They had some little things sort of go their way also during the course of the game. And we just saw, you know, specifically in the third quarter, which we'll get to, we saw the team actually was all effort. That was able to kind of actually pad a lead in what ended up being a pretty, I wouldn't call it hostile, but I would call it engaged crowd in Toronto. Like this
first time they had a crowd back in there. Yeah.
Yeah, like a real crowd. I mean, I think they'd had like something like 500 or 1,000 people at a time spread out to infinity. So I don't think anyone would
Right.
count that. I don't think anyone would count that as a crowd. But they were up for this game. Like we saw it. They had a full blackout in terms of like they had the full black shirts waiting for everybody, so the whole crowd could be dressed in black. We saw they got on Dragic every single time he touched the ball because whatever they perceive it to be a slight that he didn't want to play for him. Fair, whatever. I mean, the energy they kept up with that was pretty remarkable because they really booed him every time he touched the ball. I know he only played 15 minutes, but in the end, like this is a tough thing. You go up on the road. I know to a away stadium. I know Toronto has to make the same trip as them, but there was a lot. I'll say this: there was a lot of things ripe for getting blown out again. Like again, no moral victories. They could have won this game. Someone could say they should have won the game based on a few things that went wrong. But you can't blame I don't think you can blame the players here because I think there was a lot. The deck was stacked against them. Again, -8 road favorites. Vegas. Don't at me with anything around like, well, Vegas is wrong. No, Vegas in the aggregate is right all the time. So that's why they make all the money. And like if you come in as an 8-point dog, you are expected to lose, maybe going away, and that just didn't happen for them. So
plus, by the way, you also had Andre Drummond, who was in the last game. Talk about an opportunity for a blowout, right? He had that little bit of ended up calling, I think, knee soreness. So they're saying cautious around him, so he doesn't play in this game. You take some guy with size and length for you, obviously that plays a factor in it as well. And it's hard to come out of that blowout loss. That's the other point I want to get to real quick here. Was you mentioned, because I asked you after the blowout loss, do you think that there's this carryover effect? And we've gotten these sample sizes, right? Blown out by Boston. Now, I know Kyrie played against Milwaukee, but win against Milwaukee. Blown out by Toronto the night before. You come right back. Even these role players are able to switch the flip and come in the next game and say, hey, we feel like we can come in and execute. And I did think that they made a lot of the positive adjustments from the game prior to say, we know the little things we can clean up, the automatic stuff. Now it's about, can we make some adjustments about the team we're going up against here and see if we could get this win. So it was that was frustrating too, but I feel like all the themes that we talked about after the blowout carried right over into this game. The results were both losses, but you can tell the difference around how you should be evaluating this team and these players in absence of the stars.
I just like that we're going to say switch the flip from now on instead of flip the switch. Like we're going to switch the flip. Hey, let's go. Turn it on. Switch the flip. No, look, I think that one thing that gets underrated sometimes in the NBA is that there are times where seeing a team more than once is an advantage, right? Now, look, you could say, okay, well, that's an advantage to Toronto too, because they saw the Nets the other night. But if you can pinpoint specific things that were sort of going wrong for you also, or things that might have been able to help you, like for instance, Drummond not being able to start this game probably ends up becoming a little bit of a net positive because they're forced to play Aldridge in a spot where Drummond is not going to help you based on like sort of the wings that the Raptors are going to run out there. Mm-hmm. And Aldridge is going to provide. He's not going to provide anything more on the defensive side, but they're still going to play drop coverage, and he can play, but at least he can score a little bit more, right? Like, so I think like that sort of ended up helping them a little bit. In all said and done, I thought Aldridge, despite some late game gaffes, which I know 100% we're going to talk about, that he ultimately was a net positive in this matchup because he is able to score over like some really long rangier defenders that Toronto seems like they have a never ending supply of. Like it feels like they just have a conveyor belt of guys that are like 6'8" and above that can just come in and fly all over the court on defense. And we saw it in the fourth quarter specifically. So anyway, okay,
we'll get to somewhere in Canada, and they're just producing these guys.
Yeah, what's going on there? How do they do that? Like I gotta figure out. They spent the pandemic creating some kind of laboratory where they just have like 6'8" guys that just look like looks like there's no space in the court. Okay, we got other stuff obviously to get to here. Plenty to talk about. Want to talk about the third quarter stuff. Got to talk about some maybe Jacque Vaughn issues in terms of the coaching. Maybe some curious decisions that I think in the moment we identified, and they probably reared their ugly head a little bit. Also, first, I'm going to talk to you about our friends over on Prize Picks. Look, if you're not using Prize Picks, if you're using some of these other daily fantasy sites for your player props, I really don't know what to tell you at this point. Like Prize Picks is such the better offering when it comes to specifically looking for player props because it's just daily fantasy made easy. You're not trying to put in all those lineups. You're not up against a ton of sharks that are putting in, a million lineups with a big bankroll. No, it's just you versus the numbers. That's it. Over under on all the different stats that you can think of, really almost any player that you can think of also. So if you're deep into the bench players and stuff like that, this Prize Picks is definitely going to be your site. You pick 2 to 5 players, you pick the over under on their projections. You can win up to 10x. That's 10 times on any entry. And just like I said, just you versus those projected numbers. You can make entries in just like a minute or less. It's super easy, super safe and fast withdrawals, which is really saying something these days. It's an award-winning app. It's on the App Store and Google Play. Prize Picks allows you to mix up sports. So if you want to mix up maybe a little NBA, a little hockey all at once, if MLB ever comes back, RIP MLB maybe at this point, but if they come back, you can slam them all together here on Prize Picks. For a limited time, Prize Picks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for all of our users. You're going to get $50 for free if a single player on your Prize Picks entry scores a single point. It's pretty easy, but you must use the code NBA. That's right. Exclusive offer available for Locked On fans. Sign up today and use the code NBA. $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
Hey, man, check out Locked On now when you're done making us your first listen of the day, because it's got all those local experts from around the league. Again, nail biter for Brooklyn. How is Sean Woodley going to talk about the Toronto Raptors? They can have you covered over there. So go ahead and enjoy that. It's obviously something that only the Locked On Podcast Network can provide for you. Before we talk about some of the other sequences, this is a part of the game here, as we say, the decision that Jacque Vaughn had to make. You mentioned it there in the last segment to close it out. Drummond not being available just forced you to have to go a little bit deeper into your rotations around the 4 and the 5. And it wasn't just incidental that Pascal Siakam early in the third quarter picked up his 4th foul. He ultimately fouled out in the 4th of this one. So there's a couple of things I just think, to your point, that fell into the Brooklyn Nets lap to have an opportunity to get this one. But get into Jacque Vaughn, because I think there's some things like going to a Nic Claxton and utilizing him a little bit more, getting some positive runs out of a couple of these key guys that you had. Blake Griffin, I thought, had some nice sequences for himself. Bruce Brown continues to play good games, but it's a fine line between making a smart move or trying something different, getting a positive result, and then hanging on to it maybe a little bit too long.
Okay, so let's stick with the positives first, because there's a few negatives. Okay, so in the third quarter, let's skip ahead to the third quarter of this game, where this game really sits on an access point of between the third quarter and the fourth quarter. And these 2 quarters were the difference between winning and losing the game for the Nets. And so the positives of the third quarter, the Nets have a few sequences where what I thought was a lineup that I kind of hated, that had Claxton, Griffin, Cam Thomas, Dragic, and actually I forget
James Johnson.
And James Johnson, which
That's
I was
why
like,
you hated it, because you see those 3 guys, you go, I don't know.
Yeah, so you're like, where's the spacing? We got 1 ball creator, 2 ball creators, but like not much spot up shooting, and it's just gonna be super clogged. But this lineup ends up really just going absolutely to the wall on defense.
Yeah.
To the point where they had a few of these, like I would call energy plays that sometimes can make you feel like you're going to start pulling away in a game. Specifically, there's the Claxton shooting a little sort of like pass that they were trying to get to the 3-point line, where he gets his super long arms out, takes it away, and then shows off that he actually has, we've known this a little bit, that he has open court skills, takes it coast to coast and dunks it home. Cam Thomas has another one off a steal where he takes it to the rack. It doesn't go in, but then Blake gets the follow through. And then the third play where they get, a total miracle, switch Blake onto Malachi Flynn, which is like, what is Toronto doing? It's the one thing they can't do. They get a total miracle, and he takes him to the post. And that wasn't like consecutive, but those are the 3 plays that you really have to take note of. And they pull out to a 9-point lead. So it's one of these things where, like, I wouldn't have put it together in terms of the lineup, but the results were clearly there, and it was influenced by, I know they got those things on offense, but it was influenced by just really knuckling up on defense at that point, because that group, what you're hoping for with that group, and I'm sure what Jacque Vaughn is hoping for with that group, is that they are going to challenge some of the length that Toronto has and live with the idea that the offense isn't as good, because like sneakily, like Toronto doesn't have a ton of on-ball creation either. And so because it's really just Flynn and like a half a Gary Trent, and they don't really have anything else. Like Barnes, there's also nice players, but they're not, you wouldn't really call them like end the shot clock creators. And so they were really gambling that this was going to work. And it really did for the third quarter. Like that length actually gave Toronto problems, and they were able to steal some points away. So I got to give them credit for getting a little different there. Dragic was really good during these stretches too, in terms of just sort of slowing the action down when needed. But did you see the same thing? Like I was like, I have to admit when I'm like, okay, what is happening here with this lineup? But then it actually works. So I want to be careful. But I want to couch that first before we get to the other thing later.
Yeah, no, and I think there's something to that idea of, because I saw it in the moment, and they mentioned it on the broadcast too. And you did. So you look up and you go, oh yeah, that's the 5-man lineup. And that carried over. That was the start of the fourth quarter there. Yes. Where you go, yeah, that's the 5-man lineup you expected to start the fourth quarter with. But what I think ends up happening there, it's the proverbial necessity is the mother of invention, right? You don't have the limitless options that you prefer to have to be able to create a nice and balanced 5-man lineup for yourself. And then because of that, I think Jacque Vaughn looks at it and says, at some point, if I want to be able to fully clamp down defensively and disrupt what the Raptors are trying to do, I may have to accept that I'm going to be a very limited offensive unit, because when you do try to balance it out, let's say with a Patty Mills or with a Seth Curry mixed in with that, along with a Cam Thomas, well, all of a sudden you lose some of the size against a team like the Raptors. You know that those guys aren't plus defenders. And it really created a lot of pockets that we saw throughout this. When the Raptors had a couple of big runs, a lot of the work was being done inside the arc, the mid-range game. Scotty Barnes, you mentioned Trent Jr. even, who had a nice little game for himself. All of these players are able to access their spots, and without having a very effective offensive game plan, shot creation on the ball, the size was the overwhelming piece, getting a couple of extra rebounds here and there, even though the Nets played them fairly neutral on the boards. Inside of that too, the other positive,
real quick, just before we move on to this thing, I want to make one more thing about this length. Like what I think they were, because I think you're going to go to something else. I think what they were trying to contend with in this game too was they were just getting, again, murdered on the offensive glass. Like without Drummond, we just know this is not a good rebounding team. And so what you're trying to do is like, you're trying to just give yourself like one more mini option at like these 50-50 rebounds, because they again got totally killed on the offense, 16-7 on the offense. Well, 16-7. Toronto had 16 offensive rebounds. It doesn't matter how many offensive rebounds the Nets had, because that's just at the other end of the court. 16 on that
piece was good.
Yeah, 16 offensive rebounds on that end of the court where they're just clearly losing that battle. So I think he's trying to combat against that too, which I'm okay with for stretches. So anyway, whatever you're going to say else, but I just wanted to contend that I thought that was like the one other part that they were trying to do with the ultra big lineup.
Was what we talked about all year with them, by the way, to that point. Even when they've been fully healthy, the Nets, and we've always said, when you look at the number of shots that the opposition gets, the Nets usually lose that battle on a game-to-game basis, because they're usually losing offensive rebounds. They're not getting the second chance points for themselves, and the opposition usually is. In this game, 84-90 in terms of shots, right? And that's not, sometimes the margins have been a little bit wider for them, and that's the point, to your point, where you're saying, hey, limit them to a one and done opportunity. Whatever the look's going to be, let's get ourselves back the other way and then live with whatever the results are going to be. And to that point, I thought that Cam Thomas, who only had 4 points in the first half, I saw it in the first half of this game. We've talked about him over these last handful of games where it looks like he's getting more comfortable. Looks like he's finding his rhythm. I thought in the first half, he got to his spots on the floor. He found his little pockets to create a mid-range or even, a little 7-foot jumper for himself. They didn't go down. Now, he only finished with 11, but he actually had a couple of key sequences at the start of that fourth quarter where he was the guy. You're the on-ball shot creator. Go try to get a score for yourself. You mentioned, even if you come up short, that's where these defensive-minded, we'll call them bigs, like Blake Griffin, can be there to help clean it up. So I thought that he had a nice game for himself as well, and I'm continuing to just be curious about how he progresses forward, because we did see a little bit of Nic Claxton. We saw a little bit of Kessler Edwards early, and then he was done for the night. But now this is the rookie who maybe is still finding a way to create value for himself. He did a nice job. And before we do move into the negatives, were there any other positive you took away from this? I'm going to always continue to say this as long as it keeps happening. Bruce Brown continues to be playing very well. And
he was the only one I was going to throw in. I thought he was mostly fine for what he was trying to do. Probably forced a few shots at the rim when he gets a little floater happy. I get why he has to, so I can't really dig him on it, because they just need the offense at times. And so I can't really call it a negative. I thought Curry was really good again. Like I think that in general, I can't really individually, I actually can't really say anything bad about this game. I thought individually that this was all a pretty good effort, right? For what they were trying to contend with, and the little chances, this is again, I can't stress this enough. And I know this is why Jacque Vaughn probably did it, and we'll get to this in a second, but this courts, this kind of team is the exact kind of team that is like really problematic for the Nets. Like they have very small guards. Like they don't have super athletic wings at all. Like they don't even have a wing really. Like James Johnson's the closest guy. Like, and they don't really have super athletic bigs. Like this is not an athletic team. And they're undersized at the 1 and 2. And if they go ultra small, they're really, really undersized. And so this Toronto team that's like, again, like seems like every guy is huge, is just going to give them problems. Like, and so like just on the defensive end. So I can't really knock any of the players, but we can get into some of this other late game stuff if you want to in a second.
Yeah. Let's talk about the things we can question around the decisions that Jacque Vaughn, I keep trying to say John Vaughn or Jacque Vaughn, either way,
it's the beer,
Jacque Vaughn had a lot of decisions to make. Before we do though, got to tell you about, of course, built.com. And that is where you'll find the Built Bars. We're now New Year's is well in the rear view, and that means that some of your resolutions about getting into better shape may have fallen by the wayside as well. That's why you need to keep Built Bar as a part of that fitness regimen, because not only these delicious, covered in 100% real chocolate bars that have great stat lines we'll get to, you also have to think about trying out the Puffs. They are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallow-y, and they're not just a protein bar, they're a delicious treat, and also, just like every other bar, covered in 100% real chocolate. Let's talk about the low calorie, high protein that can replace those candy bars you've been chowing down on. That's because most Built Bars contain just 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, only 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to those disgusting candy bars with 240 calories and 30 grams of sugar. How dare you, let alone the dozens of net carbs are thrown into your body. Mint brownie, coconut, almond, and new for this month, white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious, and new flavors come all the time, so be sure to get over to the website and check it out. They're not only delicious and good, they'll also be good for you over at built.com. So then, positives aside, where do we go here when we talk about some of the late game sequences from Jacque Vaughn, sticking with a couple of these positive vibes for a sequence or two beyond, and not being able to ultimately get some key stops down the stretch here when you needed the most. And by the way, I shouldn't even said it that way. Some key stops down the stretch, and also some key offensive sets here that we've noticed in the absence of the stars, things do tend to bog down when they matter most.
Okay, so I have 3 critiques on the coaching end here, and one is actually totally founded based on a post-game quote that Nash said. Okay, the first, or sorry, Nash, geez, Vaughn said. Too used to saying.
Nash called in, he said, let me tell you what I didn't like about this.
Okay, so the first critique is that third quarter unit that I praised for really playing well and extending the lead off the defense. I thought that core unit, that he stuck with that group like 2.5 minutes too long into the fourth. Mm-hmm. Like at that point, you got like everything you ever could have imagined and more out of that group that really had no business scoring in any like conceivable fashion, and they did it. And he just needed to press the eject button and get another scorer back, like a Curry or a Mills, back onto the court. Like, and they just didn't do it quick enough. And it showed, because they really, I mean, they had 2 points into the fourth quarter at like, I think the first 5 minutes of the fourth quarter like that. They just could not score. All the problems you thought that were going to happen with that unit reared their ugly head at the beginning of the fourth. So that's my first critique about sort of what happened here.
And the saving grace was that Toronto took so long to find their offense in the fourth quarter, right, that it almost masked the idea. To your point, it took them a long time, Brooklyn, to get off of 2 points in the fourth. It just happened to be that Toronto wasn't getting some of their looks to go. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then I'll go back to Vaughn in a second. The second thing is they had a couple just gaffes here at the end that cost them. And I'm not sure anyone was going to talk about this as much, because I think they'll focus on some other stuff. But the 2 defensive 3 seconds on Aldridge in the final 2 or so minutes of the game were brutal. One was out of a timeout. And so the first one, like, not to get too nitty gritty on this, but giving a team that's like giving Gary Trent a free throw and then the team the ball back when you're trying to come back is just a total death knell. It's impossible. Like, it's the worst possible thing that can happen. The first defensive 3 seconds was 100% correct. They came out of the timeout. They went into a zone. And there was a defensive miscommunication between Aldridge and Johnson, and he wasn't able, like, you could see, if you go back and watch it, like, go back and watch the game, you'll see Aldridge calling out, like, who's supposed to move to the corner, or like, and try to reset so he can reset out of the paint. And it just doesn't happen. And he just gets caught in no man's land, and it's a clear 3 seconds. The second one, I actually think happened because the first one was so egregious. Like, the first one was so egregious that you could never argue with it, that when Aldridge goes to reset out of the paint,
His foot just never clears. It's so close. And I actually think if the first one doesn't happen, this wouldn't have been called. But
Right.
because they were, I think, were on the lookout for it, it was still a correct call. Like, you cannot argue it. He did not clear. So those two things, those two gaffes, like, end up, I don't think people will talk about it, but those do end up costing you big. Like, giving a shot in a possession is terrible. Terrible. It's the worst thing that can happen at that moment of the game.
Well, we talked about it. So the first thing is that's where having guys like James Johnson and LaMarcus Aldridge on the court together, and the fractional lack of communication that doesn't quite get you into position and cost you. Now that's 2 points plus the possession there. Go back to the game against Milwaukee on Sunday. When I ran those down coming out of the win, it was about key missed free throws from Giannis, key missed free throws from Holiday, and then the Nets being able to go down the other way, get fouls, get to the line. And in that game, it was 8 of 9 for Kyrie Irving at the charity stripe, right? And sometimes those are the non-sexy plays you talk about, but that's your point, is like, you're not going to think about that. We're going to talk about, it's like Seth Curry hits that dagger 3 that you think gets him right back in it. And there's a couple of shots that get made there. And then the rebound in the final sequences and the foul shots that it ends up being, trying to extend the game. But those 2 plays, you effectively end up giving up. And if you have it there, it's 2 points on each one of those getting caught in the lane plus the possession. And I don't know if Toronto successfully extended the lead on both of those with additional buckets afterwards.
Well, they did extend the lead on each because he made both free throws. But I get what you're saying.
And then that's the potential of going, here's 6 points without having to on a night, unlike the game before where you were lights out from beyond the arc.
Yep.
Here's a game where you're struggling from the perimeter. You gave them 2 3-point possessions that they hadn't been able to successfully convert throughout the night.
And so here's the final critique before we get out of here. So that, and it's funny because that Curry 3, which was like amazing, really came on like a busted play. Like, that wasn't like, it was off an offensive rebound back tap, but it was more a testament because their first shot wasn't that great. But then the second shot, and really, honestly, his shot wasn't that great. It just went in because he's so good. I mean, he's like at the logo almost, and he makes the 3. Oh, so awesome shot. And we'll end on this. Goran Dragic has to be in the game at the end, like in the last 4 minutes of this game. And when you and I had talked before the show started, and he was right at 15 minutes, and we were like, okay, well, maybe it was still a workload thing. And that's why, because both of us thought, like, how is Dragic not back in the game? It was 15 minutes. That's kind of where they said they were going to be. And I was willing to just let that go, except credit Alex Schiffer from The Athletic, who covers the Nets. He had a quote from Jacque Vaughn late in this one, after the game in this one. Jacque Vaughn said the Nets, this is his tweet. Jacque Vaughn said the Nets wanted to play big down the stretch, which is why he didn't opt for Goran Dragic down the stretch. Wasn't about Dragic's workload or anything more strategic. Hearing that is so brutal. Like, on the like
active choice. Yeah,
because this is exactly what we talked about this pre-show. Adam and I, catch up before the show, talk about what beats we want to hit. The Goran Dragic thing was clearly one we were going to hit because both of us were saying you have to get him back in the game here. Like, he's been good. They need the score. They need ball creation at this point. Give it up on defense. It will be okay. Like, they need the score, especially when they're down. Like, I know he came in near the end, but it was just too late. He was a plus 15 in his 15 minutes in this game. Like, how he's not in, how that's a strategic move. Like, one of
only 3 players plus in the plus side of things for the Brooklyn Nets in this. Only,
I mean, credit to
Aldridge narrowly there, and then
credit to Vaughn for admitting it, like, and being honest about it. So I it's not a credit.
One of the times you wish they would lie. You just go.
I mean, a little bit. Like,
he's on the pitch count. That's all I can tell you.
Right, or just like, hey, that's just what we did. But like, and credit to him, because a lot of coaches won't say this, and they definitely won't say when their strategy might not have been the thing that worked. So I'm going to give him full credit on owning it, I guess, if that's his version of owning it. But man, where like everyone can kind of see, like, get him back in the game, and you're hoping the only reason is because he has a set workload of 15 minutes and they're just ramping him back up. That's not the case. Was so I read that as we started the podcast, and I just if I didn't let out an audible sigh, it was only because I kept it inside, like, because it's just brutal. It's just so brutal to hear that. Like, do they win the game? I don't know, but man, it felt like he would have given you the best chance.
Oscar from The Office, I will be apoplectic if you do not play this word. And you know what? The funny thing is too, even funny, but beyond that, because you talk about staying with the defensive lineup a second too long. Sometimes I think when we talk about a Seth Curry who had a great game or a Dragic who's playing well, because they are not the elite stars of your team, I think you have to lean into a little bit more at some point of saying, we need as many opportunities with these guys, because there may be Seth Curry got down on the baseline, got to his spot. It was a nice shot. He was frustrated that he wasn't able to hit that one after hitting the incredible dagger three to keep them in it. I think sometimes you have to be able to go to that well 1, 2, or 3 extra times. Unlike if it's a Kevin Durant, if it's a Kyrie Irving, well, guess what? 6 out of 10 times in the big spot, they go down, they make the shot, they get the foul, they go to the line. Because the offense is a little bit clunkier, you may have to sacrifice a possession to get to the opportunity. And I think that speaks to it there as well. That being the case, though,
real quick, he checks out at the 9:50 mark of that quarter and doesn't check back in until 10 seconds left.
Oh, no.
That's 10 minutes where
that's even more egregious.
It's 10 minutes where he checks out. I just had it in front of me. Shoot, I'll give me 3 seconds here. Yeah, he checks out. They're winning by 8 and he gets back in and they lose the game. Again, is Goran Dragic the X factor on your team that's going to have you win? But that's a pretty damning. It's a pretty damning. Again, I usually only say this when I'm thinking it in the moment. I really will be. I usually typically try to not be critical of moves if I was not critical in the moment. I do not want to armchair quarterback this thing, and I don't want to go into this retroactive results based commentary around what I think should have happened. Typically, the only time I get really critical about this stuff, and I think you're the same, is that if in the moment I was thinking this thing and it just didn't happen. Again, it's still results based. If they win, we're not talking about it probably, but the fact that they did and the fact that we thought in the moment, it feels pretty tough. So, okay.
And then when the coach acknowledges it in the aftermath, you feel like
at least we have more to talk about. You have more to talk.
Crystallizes it for you. Yeah.
Credit to him for giving us 4 more minutes of content to complain about it. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll give a little rundown of where the team is here in terms of the dreaded word ramp up, which is the word that if I never hear the word ramp up ever again when it comes to anything, I will be a lucky man, because
we're doing our bike tricks again.
It's that should just be on the front of the Nets yearbook at the end of the season. Just Nets next 2021-22 ramp up. Okay, we're gonna
ramp up.
What a strange trip it's been, or whatever they say. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. Check out the YouTube channel. Love the numbers we're doing over there. Subscribe to the podcast as well. Much appreciated. All the comments, 1 million comments in there today. Try to respond to some. Apologies if I didn't respond to them all, but make sure you like and subscribe over on Locked On Nets YouTube channel. The link will be in the show notes.
Hey, listen. Who's the only great American poet you need to hear from? It's yours truly. Let's switch the flip and get this thing back on track.
That's one of the all-time great American poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Yo.